Welcome back. Today we're going to have a look at the fried liver attack. Now the fried liver has a bit of a dubious reputation amongst titled players. Most players think it's very dangerous and prefer to avoid it. That being said, if you're watching this video, you're probably not a titled player yourself, which means it's quite likely that you'll catch your opponent unprepared in some of these lines. So let's jump straight into it. So the fried liver starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. This is of course the Italian, and knight f6. So this is considered quite a sharp line because it allows to reply knight g5, hitting this pawn on f7. Now the only move is to play d5. Now we take the pawn, and here the main line is of course to play knight a5. And at the top level, this is played almost exclusively. And after bishop b5 check, c6 takes, and bishop d3, we get to a very well-known gambit where black is known to have full compensation for this pawn. But that's not what we're going to look at today. Instead, we're going to look at the most popular move at the amateur level, and that is knight takes d5. Now what could be more natural? You're taking this knight and recapturing a central pawn. Well, there is a small problem. Actually, there are two, but we'll get to that a bit later. So firstly, we can go straight for the fried liver. Knight takes f7. Now the idea is of course that, well, black must take obviously, and now we play queen f3 check, hitting the king and hitting the knight. So black needs to make a decision. So of course, king g8 would run into just checkmate. Yeah, that would be pretty nasty. And if black plays move like king e7 or king e8, then we just take the knight and we have a very nice position. And so black's only principled move is to play king e6, defending this knight on d5. White continues putting pressure with knight c3, again renewing the threat on d5. And here black has two choices. He can either defend the knight with the move knight b4, or he can go to e7. So the move knight e7 seems a bit more compact, but this is actually worse, because now white can strike immediately with the move d4, and black is in big trouble. For instance, if we were to take on d4, this loses on the spot to the move knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and now queen e4 check. And now we see why we had to remove this pawn on e5, because now the black king has no good squares. For instance, if black plays the move king f6, we can even just take this pawn on d4 first. If black king goes to e6, we just come back, and next move we just pick up the knight on d5 with a winning position. So going back, black can't take on d4, but what else? Well, the only other sensible idea I can see is a move like c6, reinforcing this knight and hoping to run the king back to something like c7, where it would be relatively safe. But now we simply take on e5. And again, if the king runs, we can already take this knight on d5. So black is in a bit of trouble. For instance, if he tries b5, we just drop our bishop back, no problems. Queen e8, now we just play bishop e3, followed by queenside castles, after which the pressure on d5 will quickly become overwhelming. So going back to the starting position, knight e7 is really bad, and so black's only real try is to play the move knight b4. And this has the added benefit that it's attacking this pawn on c2. But then again, the knight on b4 can be more loose, as we'll see in a key variation. White of course castles, c6, and now we see the same idea of d4. We'll see this idea a lot, trying to blast open the e file. Now what is the point of this, you might ask? Well, if black takes on c2, which makes a lot of sense, he's hitting the rook on a1, and if it moves, then black can take on d4, and it's just a piece up. But the issue is that here, white can play d takes e5, sacrificing the whole rook. But after knight takes a1, rook d1, even though white is a rook and knight down, and black even has the move, he can't do anything about our threat of just crashing through on d5. Just look at all the black pieces on the back rank. They make a great impression. Now in a game between two very strong grandmasters, Evander Liang and Pavel from Kratov, black played move b5, and now Evander crashed through with knight takes d5. If c takes d5, then simply just bishop takes d5 and black is mated. For instance, king e7, queen f7 would be checkmate. So Pavel took the bishop, But now knight f4 check, king e7, rook takes d8, king takes d8. And material-wise, black is doing quite okay. But the problem is that now these coordinated pieces are no match for white's queen and knight, and the bishop as well. Simply queen takes c6, hitting the rook on a8, rook b8 was forced, and now knight d5. The threat is queen c7 check, winning the rook, or bishop g5 check with mate in 2, and there's no way to stop both of these nasty threats. So black resigned. So taking on c2 would lead to immediate catastrophe, and so black needs to be accurate. Now a very interesting move is to play king d7, and it makes a lot of sense. After all, we are going for the same idea that I talked about earlier, of trying to tuck the king on c7, but unfortunately white has a very strong move, and he can play the move a3, and it turns out that these two knights have some sort of issue, because if this knight on b4 moves, then white is going to crash straight through with knight takes d5, and he's going to win a ton of pawns with a continuing attack. On the other hand, after knight takes c3, of course we now take the knight on b4, and the knight on c3 is still hanging, has only one safe square for it, it goes back to d5. Now we take the knight, c takes d5, and queen takes d5 check is very strong, but even better is to bring another piece into the game with rook a5, hitting the pawn on d5. And after rook takes d5, white has a huge initiative. So going back to the starting position, black needs to play a very accurate move, and that's queen f6. Now, of course, any trade of queens would be fantastic for black, because look at this king. It would now be extremely safe, and actually very comfortable in the center. So of course white cannot trade the queens, he plays queen d1. I think this is the best option. Now queen e2 is also playable, but I think it's better to keep the e file for the rook. And a lot of correspondence players seem to agree with me on this point. Now here, black needs to find a very important move. That's the move king e7. Now the move e takes d4 looks very tempting. And actually this is quite a dangerous try, because white needs to know an only move, and that's knight e4. Which, to be fair, is not too hard to find, because the alternatives don't look that great. So black plays queen f5, hitting the knight on e4, but of course he's not really threatening to take it, because that will run into the move rook e1. So now we can continue opening up the position for our pieces. In fact, that is the key to this position. Black's king is in the center of the board, so we just need to bring our pieces out without delay. And to do so, we want to open lines with tempo, which explains white's next move, c3. We are hitting the knight on b4, and after d takes c3, b takes c3, we have opened the d file, and we can potentially play a move like bishop a3 at some point. Yeah, so knight a6, and now knight g5 check. Now, king d7 is the most logical, but it runs into the move bishop takes a6, b takes a6, and c4. And now the knight on d5 is hanging and it's pinned, so we're going to take it next move with a very comfortable position. So the principal option is probably a move like king f6, and this is going very far down the rabbit hole. But here, there's a very instructive move for white. Now with the king on f6, it would be great if we could play a move like c4, kicking the knight back, and on a good day, we might be able to make use of this long diagonal with a move like bishop b2, especially since the king is on f6. So now bishop d3 is a very strong move, hitting the queen, and we are freeing the way for the c pawn to go through. Our black's queen is a bit short of good squares, it probably needs to go to g4. Now we play bishop e2. Again, black's queen is a bit short of squares, so queen f5. And now we don't repeat, but we play the move c4, hitting the knight on d5. And the point is that if the knight moves, for instance knight to b4, then queen d8 check is immediately decisive. For instance, if king g6, then queen e8 check. And black is getting mated here. For instance, if king f6, then we can give a check, and then give another check, and that should be mate very soon. For instance, if king d6, we can give another check on d1, and if king c5, then bishop d4 check. And on the next move, some sort of nasty discovered check is going to come. For instance, king d6, bishop takes g7 looks pretty convincing. Or if black tries to go to f4, he's going to get into even more trouble, because even a move like g3 should be game over. King takes g5, even h4 now looks really strong. King h6, and now bishop c1 ends the game. g5 we simply take, and black is mated. So e takes d4 is a good try, but not quite good enough. And that's why black needs to play king e7. Very important move. We don't want to go on the d file, but we also like to bring our king back to relative safety. Rook e1, of course, what else? We will threaten the pawn on e5, and black says take it. Queen g6. Rook takes e5, king d8. And surprisingly, it's not that easy for white to stop the king from going to safety. Now white can get a very comfortable position after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, takes, c takes, and rook takes d5. Now bishop d7. Now that all the forcing moves have come to an end, it's time to stop and evaluate this position. So what do we really have? We have 3 pawns for the bishop. So this is enough material compensation in itself. But what's more important is that the black king is still struggling to get to safety. Now black's idea in the long run will be to play something like king c8, bishop c6, then something like b6 and tuck the king on b7. And then the black king would be pretty safe, and black could start to make use of his 2 bishops. But of course, we are many moves from that. And even though correspondence games think that black is alright, I feel that at the lower level, it'll be very hard for your opponent to play, especially with his uncastled king. It'll be hard for him to find a plan, and you could score some pretty easy victories from such positions. So that's pretty much all the theory for the fried liver attack. But there is one more thing I want to let you know. That is that there is another way for white to play that's also just as dangerous. And that is the move d4. And in many ways, this is a bit of a safer alternative, because in many lines, white just sacrifices a pawn rather than a piece. So it's, in a sense, less risky, and the play is more positional. So if you find these lines not to your taste, then d4 is probably a better option. So obviously, e takes d4 would be harakiri. White simply castles. Now it's ready to play rook e1 using the open e file. So black plays bishop e7, and of course if he can castle, then he'll be very happy. But that will never happen, because white now uncorks the same sacrifice that we've seen so many times in this video, and that's the move knight takes f7. Obviously black has to take back, and now queen f3 check. Now again, if we can take on d5, then it's just a crushing position. So the only principled move is king e6. Now we bring another piece into the action with check, and black blocks with knight e5, because otherwise again he's going to lose this knight on d5. Now bishop f4, threatening to crash through on e5 again, and black plays bishop f6. Now it seems like black has sort of got things under control. But now there's a fantastic move. Knight c3, hitting this knight on d5, black takes d takes c3, and now rook takes e5. Black needs to take back, and rook e1. So, black is currently a rook up, but now the threats are just overwhelming. Among other things, we want simply to take on e5 with the rook. The knight on d5 will then be very loose, and really, black is going to lose very quickly. So we don't want to see that as black. In fact, we'll be quite happy if black took on d4. So of course black needs to play knight takes d4, c3 hitting the knight on d4, and if the knight moves, we are going to take this knight on d5. So black needs to play b5. Now we simply drop our bishop back, and again, if this knight on d4 moves, then the pawn on b5 is no longer protected. For instance, if black was to play knight e6, for instance, we can give a check on b5. Taking this pawn, and that would be very nice for us. So after bishop d3, black should play the move h6, so he's counter-attacking this knight on g5, and if we take his knight, he's going to take our knight. But here we can do a very typical tactic. Knight takes f7, king takes f7, and now we simply take this knight on d4. Black takes back. Well, he can throw in the move bishop b4 check before taking back. We're simply going to block, and if he takes, simply knight takes d2, e takes d4. Now it seems like this helps black because he's managed to develop one of his pieces with tempo, which means one less piece stuck on the back rank. And he's also going to activate his rook. But on the other hand, we have developed the knight already, which proves to be more useful. So queen f3 check, a very important move, making sure that black can't bring his rook to e8, otherwise we would be struggling to find compensation. So if black blocks with the queen, then oops, the knight is gone, and if knight blocks, then the rook is gone. So the only move is to play king g8, and now we simply castle. c6 is very logical to defend this knight. Now we play rook fe1. Black plays queen f8, of course, because black would love to trade queens, and if we move the queen, he'd love to develop his bishop. But now comes a very typical move in this line, so remember this idea. We play the move a4, so we're trying to break up this whole structure on the queen side. And if black trades queens, we'll take back with the knight. And now not only is b5 under attack, but the pawn on d4 is also under attack. So we are going to gain back our material with really a pretty dominant position. Not to mention that the move rook e8 check, winning a rook on h8, is also a threat. In fact, it's the biggest one. So the main line is to play e takes d4. Now again, we simply castle. We just want to complete our development quickly. And then with our active pieces, black will face some serious tactical issues. Black plays c6. It's the most logical move, defending the pawn on b5, securing the knight. And again, we see this same idea with a4. We're trying to break up the structure again. And really, black has to take on a4 to avoid losing material. So we take back with the rook, activating another one of our pieces. Now c5 would be extremely loose, so bishop b4 seems like the most logical move. You're trying to cut off the rook and develop a piece. Now we give a check on h5, of course. Black plays king g8. And now a very nice move. Bishop d2. So we're threatening this bishop in b4, and after it takes on d2, we simply take back with the knight, developing yet another piece and renewing the threat on the pawn on d4. Now black is really unable to complete development, and we can continue very simply with a move like rook e1, bringing our last piece into the game. For instance, if black tries to hold on to the pawn on d4 with a move like c5, this would be quite bad, because after rook e1, it's very awkward to stop this threat of rook e8. For instance, bishop d7 simply hangs the knight on d5, so that would be embarrassing. No other good bishop moves except for bishop b7. Obviously, if knight f6, we simply take this pawn and another pawn and we win the game. So really, bishop b7 is the principal move. But here, what has a really nice tactic. So if you want to, you can pause this video and try to find it. So I hope you guys managed to find the really nice move, rook takes a7. And the idea is, of course, we want to exploit the back rank issues that are inherent in black's position. For instance, if black takes on a7, we simply give a check on e8. The king has no squares, so black must take, and after queen takes e8, it's actually checkmate. And if black tries to move his rook away, that's not going to help, because we again use the same idea to win more material. Rook takes v7, and again if rook takes v7, rook e8 check is a familiar story. So we can see that this line is actually very dangerous for black, and objectively it could even be stronger. So we can see that the line with d4 is actually very dangerous, and objectively it might even be stronger than the fried liver attack. So certainly a very valid alternative to consider. Now, which of these moves is better, d4 or knight takes f7? Now, I always say it's really a matter of taste. One just leads to crazy messy positions, and one leads to a more controlled game. But both are very strong, and it's really up to you which one you prefer. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more Italian theory, then definitely check out my previous video, and I'll see you there.